to an introduction to implicit bias with our guest speaker, Lucas Elbaum. Lucas is going to introduce the topic of implicit bias, as well as some potential steps to mitigate its impact and to help us hopefully be better prepared to address implicit bias with others. We have some interactive portions and we'll aim to leave time at the end for questions. So usually our 411 Wednesdays are just about 60 minutes, but due to this topic and wanting to offer an opportunity for some more interaction, we'll run about an hour and a half tonight. So a little bit about our speaker, Lucas Elbaum is an ELD, that's English Language Development Content Specialist with the Multilingual Pathways Department at SFUSD, working primarily with middle and high school educators to advance instruction for English learners. Prior to the Multilingual Pathways Department, Lucas joined SFUSD in 2014, working for the Office of Access and Equity to lead professional development around racial equity and culturally responsive practices with educators throughout the district, where he still continues to work today. Lucas was also a middle and high school teacher of social studies and English language development in Ecuador, Pennsylvania, and the Galapagos. So welcome, Lucas.
Thank you, Melissa, for that great introduction there. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight, too. I'm really heartened to see how many folks have showed up at 7:30 on a Wednesday evening here. And just to welcome you again to this little ed talk that I'm going to be giving here. I'm actually going to pause real fast so I can share my screen with you, show you some fun stuff here. I also want to actually mention I am joined here by a few of my colleagues tonight I see out there. But in particular, my colleague, Nicole Henderson, she's going to be kind of helping me out in the background there. Hey, Nicole. She's going to share just a couple links throughout this chat tonight. She'll be also kind of keeping an eye on the chat box there. So in case there are questions that come up along the way, toss them in the chat there. And if they start to pile up, Nicole can give me a shout out and I'll pause and we can address some of those questions as they arise here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll get going. All right. Okay, here we go. Great. So once again, this is an ed talk that I put together that I like to call, But I'm Not Racist, an Intro to Implicit Bias. And we'll talk a little bit more about why I came up with that title for this here. And so you've already heard a little bit about me, but just to introduce myself quickly again, Lucas Elbaum here. I go by with the pronouns he, him, his. I'm an ELD content specialist nowadays. However, the work that you're going to be hearing about tonight is kind of the continuation, accumulation of a few years of work that began when I joined the district as a teacher on special assignment with the Office of Access and Equity. Like Melissa mentioned, that department was all about designing and implementing professional development around, explicitly around racial equity. And so implicit bias was one of the strands that we really dug into there. And so I really feel honored to continue to have the platform to present this work. And I really need to give a big shout out to the folks that have done a lot of the research behind what I'm presenting here, because basically what I'm doing is telling you all the things that I've learned over the years. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is coming from the Kirwan Institute, and I'll share some links so you can check out their work directly. A lot of other work is coming from Jerry Kang and some of the folks down at UCLA that were continuing to do research around implicit bias and its impact in various fields here. So I'm greatly indebted to them for the work they've been doing and continue to do. And I'd like to start off by sharing with folks the definition that San Francisco Unified is using for this word equity that we talk about a lot. So in San Francisco Unified, we say that equity is the work of eliminating oppression, ending biases, and ensuring equally high outcomes for all participants through the creation of multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-ability, and multiracial practices and conditions, as well as removing the predictability of success or failure that currently correlates with any social or cultural factor. It's a big definition here. And I like to couple that definition with this quote when I'm starting off this ed talk here. This came from an article about a year ago. The title of the article was Equity Work, Too Much Talk, Too Little Action. And now, mind you, I tend to give this ed talk primarily to educators, primarily teachers. And so this article was addressing those folks in particular, saying that teachers do need to learn much more about their students, cultures which are not their own, and how to teach across lines of difference. People do need to look within as well as without. So it's not that talk, reflection, reading, and learning are unimportant. To the contrary, they're critical. But this learning will be much more constructive and much more likely to be sustained if it is interwoven with actions that lead to change. I agree with this quote wholeheartedly here. But I like to call it out right at the beginning here, just to draw attention to the fact that what we're going to be doing tonight, what I'm going to be doing here, is really just that first part. This is going to be more talking. This is the learning part. And again, I do feel like this is critical to the work that we have to do. But there's more than just us coming here and talking about it tonight. And I'm going to be starting to bring up some ideas about how we can address some of the impacts of implicit bias. But the real work is what we do after this tonight. And I really just want to make sure that that's clear and just really kind of set expectations for both myself and anybody that's joining here tonight for what kind of part of the work we're going to be getting into here. And so with that, I offer some kind of modest objectives here. Like Melissa mentioned, tonight's is going to be about beginning to explore this topic of implicit bias and think about how it informs our work again as educators, and that I think about this topic is really for educators, but also thinking about how it informs us in our day-to-day lives too, or wherever we go to in our work. And I'd like to again begin to reflect on some approaches for mitigating the impact of implicit bias. And again, this is a beginning, and think about how we can use these approaches in our work as educators and of course beyond. Some norms to offer here. General meeting norms are the ones that we use in SFUSD, keeping equity at the center for students and adults, owning our intention and our impact, be part of the solution, and be present and engaged. And I hold myself to those norms as well. I also offer a few virtual meeting norms. I know you may all have some separate ones as well, but these are the ones that I tend to think of. I ask to have your camera on when possible in breakout rooms. Of course, if that's not possible, no stress, but I like to do that just to help us build community with each other, get to know who you're talking to. Of course, put your mic or your mute on when you're not talking, just in order to reduce that feedback. And like I mentioned before, use that chat box to ask questions or request any assistance you might need along the way. We are going to be using breakout rooms tonight, and so sometimes that gets a little tricky. So feel free to use the chat box, or of course, just unmute yourself if you really need a hand. And so actually, we're going to start off real fast here by going into a quick breakout group. I like to keep the breakout groups consistent throughout the evening. So you're going to be probably talking to the same 4 or 3 other people or so throughout the course of this evening. And I do that just so you don't have to like reintroduce yourself each time you go into a breakout group. But just for this first one, I'm going to ask you to first, of course, introduce yourself. You might want to share your name, the pronouns that you prefer, your child's school or grade, or anything else you want to share with your group. And also think about sharing what's bringing you to this particular session tonight. What are you hoping to get out of being here? And maybe share any other learning or work you've done or are currently doing related to the topic of implicit bias, because I know a lot of us here in this space probably are already doing some work. So I'm going to go ahead and pop us into breakout rooms here. Okay. You should either get a message asking you to join, or depending on your Zoom, it'll send you there automatically. But I'm going to bring us back here in about 5 minutes. So enjoy getting to meet each other. Right, we're back on recording here. All right, and if you didn't notice before, Nicole, my fabulous colleague here, had popped the agenda in the chat box there in case you're interested. Don't really need it right now, but I know some folks kind of like to have an idea of where I'm going. And then you'll also see some other links in there that I'll be referencing later on. So feel free to grab that out of the chat box if you're interested to take a look. All right, so let's get into this topic of implicit bias. And you can use your emojis to respond to these questions here, or just raise your hand. I'm gonna ask a quick couple of questions here to start us off tonight. By quick show of hands, who here has a preference for white people over African Americans? Not seeing too many hands, good. Who here has a preference for thin people to overweight people? Okay, not too many takers. Who here has a preference for able-bodied people over people with disabilities? Good. Well, I'm glad to know that I don't see too many hands popping up. And of course, I'm asking these sort of provocative questions, knowing that they're provocative, but also knowing that there's some research out there that despite the fact that very few of us raised our hand for any of these questions, that the research is showing that nearly 70% of people have somewhat of a preference for white people over African Americans, similar for thin people to overweight people, and about 40% have a preference for able-bodied people over people with a disability. And this is research coming from the implicit association test, which I'll be talking about later. But these are also just questions that force us to say, wait, what? And like the title of this Ed Talk tonight, but I'm not racist, or I don't have these other biases, but yet there's this other data and there's these other impacts that are coming out in our world that seem to say otherwise. And in fact, I was talking with Michelle during the breakout rooms there. This topic of this term implicit bias keeps coming up over and over again in various different fields across the country and across the world, in fact, from our own district attorney's office in San Francisco to other just kind of major media news stories. And like I said, even across the world, from The Guardian in England, and even across the political spectrum, showing up in Fox News. A few years back, you might have heard about the Starbucks CEO calling for unconscious bias training, unconscious bias being another term for implicit bias. But of course, it's been getting a lot of press as it relates to law enforcement, but also it's showing up in some of the guiding documents of San Francisco Unified School District. In our Vision 2025, and it's addressing the target student groups, African American students. Vision 2025 calls for all SFUSD staff to be able to identify and mitigate the impact of implicit racial bias and have practical and research-based strategies to reduce stereotype threats that African American students and others of color experience on a daily basis. And yet, I question whether we all even have a solid understanding of what we're even talking about when we hear this term implicit bias. And so I want to start with some just kind of straightforward definitions here. And this is coming from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. And the Kirwan Institute says that implicit bias are those attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. They say that implicit bias is pervasive. It's something that exists in all humans. This is not something that just happens with white people or Black people or Latinx people. This is a pervasive characteristic of the human brain, and I'll be talking a bit more about that shortly. And kind of similar to some of those what we saw in those provocative questions there, implicit bias does not necessarily align with our declarative beliefs. And in fact, is often exactly the opposite of what we might know or feel in our heart. Research shows that implicit bias does tend to favor our own in-group, but not even exclusively. And Fortunately, some research is now beginning to show that these implicit biases are malleable. We can change them over time, and as we start to bring them into our more conscious brain. And just to drive the point home, I want to kind of draw this distinction between implicit bias and explicit bias. Explicit bias being those biases that we are aware of, that are expressed directly and operate in our conscious mind. They might come from places like this recently. They might sound like a quote like this that we've heard about, unfortunately, in the past few years here. As opposed to implicit bias, those are those biases that we are unaware of until we start to draw attention to them or put a spotlight on them in other ways. They're expressed indirectly, and they operate unconsciously without our thinking about them. And they're sometimes even harder to point out or show exactly how they come about or how they impact people. But they come about, we can look at them through graphs like this, and I'll zoom in a little bit more. And I'm actually going to ask you to pause to take a moment just to read over this graph here. And think about, how does this data reflect implicit bias? Or do you think it doesn't? Maybe think about, what are other examples of data that might expose implicit bias? I'm going to pause for another moment here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to move us into breakout groups to discuss this one right now. But if we can start to see that certain students are being disproportionately, or were being disproportionately suspended for what was referred to as willful defiance. And it's a very vague and general term, which actually, as of, I believe, 2014, was no longer used in San Francisco Unified School District because of data just like this. You can see that African-American students in particular were being disproportionately suspended for willful defiance. Hispanic or Latinx students, likewise, slightly disproportionately over-suspended, whereas other groups, such as white and Asian students, were being disproportionately less suspended for the same sort of reason. And willful defiance really came down to teachers' interpretations of students' action. It was that kind of catch-all in case there wasn't another reason that we could pin on a student. And so again, it becomes a little bit more of a nebulous thing to be able to pin down. So how is this happening? Where are these implicit biases coming from? And so, like I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about how our brain is working. And we can start off by thinking about implicit biases stemming from these schemas or these shortcuts for the brain. Schemas are like these hashtags that our brain does whenever it sees all kinds of different objects out there in the world. So whenever you see something that looks like this in the world, your brain's going to hashtag it. And so in this case, it's going to hashtag it as car. And this sort of shortcut allows our brain to understand whenever we see all these different types of things that might fall under this same hashtag, our brain can make a shortcut now. Now it doesn't have to deconstruct everything and put it back together. When I see any of these other things, it falls under this hashtag car, and I kind of know what to do with it. Even when they start to look a little bit more out there, a little bit different, even if they veer from that original schema that our brain has created. The issue, though, is that our brain doesn't really distinguish between objects and people whenever it's creating these hashtags. And so our brain is going to do the same thing that does when it sees a car when we see a person. And this is actually me here before I'd forgotten how to shave and get haircuts. So when you see when our brain sees a person like this, it starts to create hashtags. Maybe your brain hashtags this person as white. And whenever it creates these hashtags, it starts to trigger this whole world of associations that are related to this hashtag. So maybe whenever your brain sees or thinks hashtag white, maybe you think, oh, there's associations with my ability to dance. Maybe I like this hashtag white, I'm gonna hang up some inspirational quotes around my house. Hashtag white, maybe I'm the kind of person that wears red hats. Hashtag white, maybe I like to frequent chain restaurants. And of course, our brain is doing this. I'm giving this example related to race, but our brain is creating all different sorts of hashtags for a person that looks like this. So hashtag white, hashtag male. You start to learn a little bit more about me. You find out, oh, hashtag straight, hashtag 30-something, hashtag teacher. And so again, there's all this cloud of associations that are related to these different hashtags, these different schemas that our brain is creating. Hashtag straight white male. All of a sudden, our brain is able to put together some of these different schemas to create a bigger cloud of association. And these associations are kind of the basis for our stereotypes and our just kind of gut feelings, our valences that we have for these different hashtags. And these are going to all themselves create biases in our brain. But where do these schemas come from? Well, they come from a whole lot of places. They come from everything we do, almost from the moment we're born to where we are right now. So they come from our network of people that are around us, what we're talking about with them, what are they exposing us to? They come from the media that we're ingesting on TV and all kinds of other places. They come from what we're reading, what we learn both in school, but what we learn in the street and just our daily lives. They come from what we're exposing ourselves to intentionally in our nowadays in our social media network. So all of these different inputs are creating schema in our brain that are ultimately going to be creating these clouds of associations and ultimately creating our implicit biases. Implicit biases are almost like the negative outcome of these schemas, but we rely on these schemas again to make sense of this this huge amount of information that we're taking in all time. If it weren't for these schemas, we wouldn't even be able to make sense of the world. However, sometimes when these schemas are creating implicit biases and creating impact, that these biases themselves cause real world impacts, that's when we get into some trouble here. And I want to pause for a moment just to kind of illustrate another way that our brain is creating associations between concepts here. And we're going to take a quick test here. And now this is a test we're going to be doing as a group, so hopefully that lowers some of our effective filter here. I'm going to ask you to, I know you have your microphones muted, and I'm going to ask you to keep them muted here, but I'm going to ask you to actually say some things out loud. Might feel a little bit goofy if you're sitting in a room by yourself, or maybe even goofier if you're sitting in a room with people around here. But I'm going to ask you to say some things out loud here. And so when I show you the next slides, I'm going to ask you just to say the color that you see. You could ignore the letters, but just tell me the color that you see. And so I'm going to model this first row or this first column for you. Green, red, purple, green. Oops. So it's going to go just like that. So I'm going to actually put my camera on to make sure I can see everybody doing this at home. And again, just shout out the color that you're seeing here.
Blue, yellow, blue,
Blue.
red,
Green,
yellow,
red,
Purple.
purple.
Okay. Now I actually did hear a few people out there, and it sounded like, by the few people I could hear, it sounded like we pretty much got that all right. So we're gonna do this again. I'm gonna go a little faster now because I think everybody got the rules here. All right, here we go. Same rules. Just tell me the color you see.
Green, red,
purple,
green, blue, yellow, blue, red, green, yellow, red, purple.
Okay, good. All right, sounds like everybody's got their colors down here. So now that we're all warmed up, we're just gonna keep doing this one more time here. Just tell me the colors that you see, all right? we go. Just tell me the colors. I'm gonna go fast again.
Red.
Green,
Oh,
red,
blue,
purple,
purple,
blue,
yellow, blue,
green,
yellow, yellow, blue, red.
Wow. Okay. Okay. I thought that was going to be an easy test here. Everybody showed me they understood the rules of the game. Yet all of a sudden, this third round here seemed to be a lot more difficult. So in the chat box, just tell me in a few words, what felt different about those second and third rounds? And if you feel like you have an idea of what I'm getting at here, what might account for that difference? Okay, conditioning. Okay, read the word before the color. See, our brains were processing two different data sets at the same time. The first round was without thought. The second required looking beneath the surface. Okay, Nicole calling out the context matters there. And so we're starting to uncover that, obviously there is some association. Oops, don't I go backwards if I can. There's some association that we have in our minds between these letters R-E-D and the color that you see actually below it there. And so when I show you a slide like this, or I show you a set of words like this with colors like this, our brain has to kind of slow down and disassociate those two concepts. The one concept being those letters, and the other concept being those colors there. And this is the same thing that is kind of happening in our brain with those hashtags, those schemas that I'm talking about. Our brain is creating these associations. And when these associations are happening related to people and not just objects or not just a fun game of colors like that, that's when these implicit biases start to come out. It requires us to start to slow down and try to disassociate those associations we have. And in fact, this kind of association is the underlying basis for how the implicit association test works, or the IAT. This is a test that was developed, I'm forgetting the year now, but it's been around for almost 2 decades at this point. It was developed by some folks primarily out of Harvard. And in their words, they're measuring the strength of associations between concepts, in this case, concepts like Black people, gay people, white people, etc., in evaluations, for instance, things like good or bad, those gut feelings I'm talking about, or stereotypes, those sort of specific traits related to those concepts. And the IAT works by measuring how long it takes to essentially disassociate the concept from that evaluation or stereotype. And I encourage you to check out this implicit association test. It's where I got some of the data on those first few provocative questions that I put out at the beginning of this chat tonight. And you can go online and anonymously take the implicit association test. And it'll kind of give you a little bit of feedback on where some of your implicit biases lie. I'll warn you that it can be unsettling, some of the results that come out of it, but as we'll talk a little bit later on, that can be one of the first steps towards mitigating the impacts of implicit bias. And so what are the impacts of implicit bias? And like you might imagine, some of these impacts are across the field. So some of the impacts can include predicting which resumes get callbacks for interviews, the shooting of unarmed people of color by police and civilians, the negative interpretation of student behavior and facial expressions, for example, like we saw in some of that willful defiance data there. The over-identification of students of color for special education services, differing expectations for students of different demographic groups, and the potential for amplification of a concept known as stereotype threat, which again, I encourage you to check out, research about if you haven't yet. That would kind of require its own separate evening of Ed Talk. But something that's definitely been shown to be impacting our students. And so since we're here kind of coming together as a community in San Francisco Unified, I wanted to pause and really spend a little bit of extra time thinking about the impact of implicit bias in education. And if I could ask my colleague Nicole to please share in the chat box, I'm going to offer you a few minutes now just to do a little bit of reading on your own, so you don't have to just keep hearing me talking all night here. This implicit bias in education article is an excerpt from a yearly report that the Kerwin Institute puts out called the State of the Science Implicit Bias Review. And they've been doing this pretty much yearly since I believe 2012. I like this particular excerpt just for its brevity, but it is from 2013, but the science is still good there, and the impacts are still relevant. And so I hope it's all right with you all if we pause for about, let's say, 7 minutes. I'm going to check in with you all to see if you want some more time for reading. Feel free to turn off your cameras while you're reading so it doesn't feel like we're all looking over your shoulders. Okay. So we're going to come back together, and hopefully you had a chance to get through at least a good portion of that article there. And we're gonna get back together with our breakout groups here, just to give you a chance to kind of discuss what's resonating with you from the article, with what I've been talking about so far here. And maybe share with your group, how do you see the biases of students, families, educators affecting the school community? What are some of the impacts of implicit bias maybe you've experienced personally? And particularly if you've noticed anything in the article, again, that resonated with you in your own experience there. So I'm going to go ahead and try to put you right back in the same breakout rooms as before.
Will you put those prompts in the chat for me, Luke, please?
Oh yeah, I can do that for you.
Thank you.
Stop sharing here for a second. All right, coming right up here. There we go. Yeah, there's the prompts in the chat there. And I'm gonna go ahead and open the breakout rooms. You're gonna have about, let's see how we doing on time. We have about 10 minutes here in breakout rooms. I'll give you a heads up before we come back. Scratch the surface. And I apologize for that, but I did promise that I would begin to mention some of the research around what we can start to do to mitigate the impacts of implicit bias. Great, I see Dr. Fraser said there was some wonderful dialogue in there. That makes me feel heartened to know. All right, let's keep going so you have another chance to even check in with each other before we check out for tonight. All right, let me share my screen with y'all again. All right, here we go. All right, so what do? I'm going to share 4 approaches here. And again, I want to give a big shout out to Jerry Kang down at UCLA, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. You'll see some links in the agenda that are going to actually, they'll take you to some of his work and some YouTube videos he put together, because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here is drawn directly from his work. So approach number 1 here is going to be all about just noticing our mindset. And this means a few things. First off, we need to begin to view our biases with humility. Like I mentioned before, implicit biases are pervasive. This is almost just a part of what it means to be human. And then we also need to practice being mindful, especially during times of stress, which is when our implicit biases are most likely to come out. And that means slowing down, calming that amygdala or that lizard brain that causes us that fight or flight sort of reaction, and then rather proceed with intention. Like I mentioned here, implicit biases are most likely to be acted upon when we're under time pressure, when we're busy or stressed out, when we have a cognitive overload, when we need to be making multiple decisions at once. And so when I'm talking to teachers, I often pause to say, this sounds a lot like a typical classroom. But all of us find ourselves in these sort of situations, under these sort of conditions. And so we need to notice when that's happening. Again, working with educators, I reference some of the work that comes from Zaretta Hammond. She offers the SOTA strategy, as she calls it, for times like this, which is all about stop, observe, detach, and awaken. So stop in those moments when you feel yourself being triggered, observe the moment, what's actually happening, try to detach yourself from it, try to not feel so personally invested, and awaken to what some other different perspectives might be that would allow you to proceed with intention. And again, that comes from Zaretta Hammond and her work around culturally responsive teaching in the brain. So to kind of complement what I just said there, it also sort of requires us to get to know our triggers so that we can know when those implicit biases might flare up. Common triggers, again, coming from Zaretta Hammond's work, might be these. So when our sense of importance relative to others might feel threatened, our standing, our certainty, so needing to feel clear or be able to know what's happening next. If that's threatened, that can be a trigger. Our sense of control over a situation is a common trigger. Our feeling of connection with others. So hence, whenever we're talking about, when I'm talking with teachers, building that sense of community in the classroom is key to be able to overcome implicit biases. Also, a trigger comes around equity, that sense of fairness between others. So if that's feeling like it's threatened, that can be a trigger for implicit biases as well. Approach 2 comes around getting to know our own cultural frames of reference. And this isn't totally unrelated to that first approach either. And so I'm going to use this guy here, again, as a point of reference, this guy being me. So for myself, I need to think, when I'm thinking about my own cultural frames of reference, I need to, remind myself, ground myself in the fact I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I come from a white family with a mother and a father and a sister. My dad was Jewish. My mom was Catholic. I went to a high school where it was kind of assumed that I would go on to college, and I went on and got a master's degree too. I'm from the United States, but I've spent a lot of time living in Ecuador, speaking Spanish now as my second language. I mentioned before that I'm straight and I have a wife. And I now live in San Francisco, which, being a transplant here, kind of that has a lot of identity issues tied up in it as well. And obviously I work for San Francisco Unified, so I sort of identify as a teacher, as an educator. And so I need to be in touch with these different frames of reference and recognize that this is all these pieces and much more that I can't even fit into a Google slide are all coloring my worldview and all sort of setting the foundations for what might become my implicit biases. Approach 3, again, coming from the folks at UCLA, they talk about creating new narratives. And this might mean having meaningful exposure to counter stereotypical exemplars. So maybe noticing when we're encountering female scientists or Latinx doctors or Asian folks who are excelling in sports. So folks that are really counter stereotypical to what the stereotype might be about their particular group. We're lucky to be living here in the Bay Area, which is a vibrant place, and we probably get to have exposure to these counter stereotypical exemplars in our day-to-day life. But start to notice, how often are we exposing ourselves to these things? And how often are we creating a world in which we get these counter stereotypical exemplars, such as like, what's the social media that we're exposing ourselves to? What's the screensaver on the background of your computer? What kind of posters do we have hung up around our living area? And then thinking about our kids, what are the exemplars that we are intentionally exposing them to. Also under the sort of umbrella of this approach of creating a new narrative, the folks at UCLA recommend trying out so-called stereotype replacement. And this gets into recognizing whenever we might be responding to a person and it's based on a stereotype. So again, keeping that in the forefront of our mind, recognizing when it's happening, labeling it as stereotypical, and questioning, why did our brain cause this sort of reaction? What caused this sort of reaction of a person in our brain? Where is that coming from? And then actively replace it with a counter stereotypical narrative. Approach 4 is more getting to the systems level. And this has us think about the structures or the patterns that we're using in our work to do things like identify candidates for a job. How are candidates then chosen for the job? And what biases might be inherent to how we're choosing people. And so one example of this comes from totally outside the world of education, but the symphony, I think it was the New York Symphony, noticed back actually in the 70s that the musicians in their symphonies were almost 100% male. And they started to question, why is that happening? And so they started to change the way that they were conducting their interviews or how they were choosing candidates by having folks rehearse for them behind a screen. They couldn't see who was playing for them. And by simply making that one change in how folks were applying for the job, playing their instrument, they found they were able to up the number of females represented in their symphonies by almost 20%, just by that one simple change. And so there's been a lot of talk over the past few years here, of course, in our district around how we're identifying students to go to certain schools. And we might need to question those structures and consider, are there better ways that we could be doing this that might overcome some of the implicit biases that are built into those very structures? And so I want to pause one last time here for you to kind of reflect and make some meaning. And I know I went through those very quickly because I did want to make sure that we had some time for you all to think about these approaches that I shared there. And when you get back together with your breakout groups, I would like you to think about which approach might be useful for you personally, which approach might be useful for your community, whether it be your school community or otherwise. And then thinking about, like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, what are going to be your next steps after we part ways this evening? How might you begin to implement that approach? And what would be those next steps? Who would you need to talk to? What would you need to be doing yourself there? And I'm going to go ahead and take Don's suggestion from before and pop those into the chat for you, those prompts, before I bust out these breakout groups here. And I'll also put into the chat there the approaches themselves, so you have those to reference. All right. And I'm going to try to bring us back with about 5 minutes left for closing moves. So that means we'll have about 10 minutes in breakout groups here. See you shortly. Oh, good. Hey, Nicole.
I was just texting you back. No worries, everything already worked out. I was
All right,
like,
good.
still finishing dinner, so.
Right on. I felt so bad. Like I saw that message you sent like right after I opened the breakout groups. I'm like,
No, it's
stuck.
all good, all good. We had like 5 people in our group, so if they're the same breakouts, there's going to be 4 people there. Like there's plenty of people for the conversation, and Don was in there, so we had
Okay, good.
like you said, good dialogue. There was like 2 equity folks, and the participants that we were in conversation with were super engaged and sharing some really cool anecdotes and connections. So
Awesome. That's great.
I'm super excited.
Michelle, just for some context here, Nicole is my colleague from the Professional Learning and Leadership. I'm sorry, have you guys met before? You might.
No,
I
we
don't
have
think
not.
so. Nice to meet you, Michelle.
Nice to meet you too.
So yeah, Nicole and I have been we work together actually as part of it's called the Leading for Equity Committee. And so that's one of the ways that I've gotten to have. All right, welcome back everybody. And I apologize, I know that's never enough time, but somehow it's almost 9 o'clock and I want to respect your time here. You know, in my heart of heart, I'm a teacher. So after our time together, I can't help but to close things off with one last test here. This is another test though that we can do all together. So we can lower our effective filters again. Just relax, sit back. I think we're going to do just fine on this one. The last one did get a little rough there, but we'll try this one out. This one's an awareness test. And hopefully the internet world will allow me to play this for you.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? Go! The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear? Go!
All right. So that's just a little way to just wrap things up here. That's an ad for cyclists, but I think the message pertains to everything we've been talking about. If there's one thing that we can hopefully walk away with tonight, it's hopefully an increased awareness about our implicit biases. Hopefully this has begun to get us closer towards being able to use some of those approaches that I mentioned there and bring those implicit biases much further to the forefront of our brain into our more conscious mind, where we can actually work with them. I'm offering here some of the references and resources that I've been using throughout the night. I think I have all of these listed as well on that agenda that Nicole shared earlier, along with some links that will take you directly to some of the source material that I've been using there. I would welcome and I'd love to hear from you all. If you have any questions, comments, or just want to say hi, let me know what you thought about tonight, what you want more of. You can drop me a line at my email there, which is also found on the agenda there. And with that, I'm going to pound the gavel and say good night to everybody. I'm going to stick around here if anybody does have any questions or wants to just chat a little bit more. I'll be around for the next few minutes. I really, again, just want to give you a huge thank you for coming out tonight and spending your evening with us here. And really am honored that I'd be asked to come around, hang out with you all here. So until next time, have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody, for coming. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.